Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode number 85 of the BeerSmith podcast. It's late July 2014, and today my guest is Michael Tonsmeire, author of the new book, Sour Beers. Today's podcast is sponsored by the American Homebrewers Association Forum at homebrewersassociation.org/forum. Join 22,000 fellow brewers discussing beer, brewing, troubleshooting, and more. You can also access it from the Tap a Talk app on your mobile device. The forum is free to join. Just go to homebrewersassociation.org and sign up today. And also, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, the newest magazine on beer brewing. The second issue is 120 pages, packed with great advice on brewing saisons, Belgian beer, blending beers, new hop varieties, and much more. Go to beerandbrewing.com and use the offer code BeerSmith to get a 20% discount on your subscription. Again, use the offer code BeerSmith at beerandbrewing.com to get 20% off on your subscription. And finally, BeerSmith software. Get started designing your own recipes today by downloading the free 21-day trial of the desktop version of BeerSmith from beersmith.com. It's available for Mac, PC, Linux, and we also have a mobile version for Android and iOS. And now let's move on to this week's episode. I'd like to welcome Mr. Michael Tonsmeire back to the show. Michael's been my guest several times before, including episode number 22 on session beers and episode number 54 on pro brewing. Michael's the author of the new book on American sour beers, just released by the Brewers Association, and he also runs a website at madfermentationist.com. Michael, it's great to have you on the show.
It's always great to be back on your show.
Really happy to have you here, and congratulations on your new book on sour beers.
Thank you very much. It's been in the works for about 3.5 years now.
3.5 years, that's all, huh?
Yeah, just 3.5 years.
Well, you got the new book. It's titled American Sour Beers, which made its debut at the National Homebrew Conference. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. This is sort of actually a weird story how this book came about. I've been writing the blog for a couple of years, and I thought at that point, I'd written a blog, I'd had a lot of information that was just sort of out there in the ether, and I'd want to put all those ideas together, put everything I'd learned together into a book, and probably just sort of self-publish it. I'd actually, I think, talked to you about it after one of the shows I'd been on. Mm-hmm. And I was just proceeding down that path for about 2 years, and I talked to a couple of pro brewers, and I'd been writing some articles, and I thought, well, why not ask them a couple of questions and get their perspective on things? And people were just so open, and I got such terrific information that it really changed the focus of the book and went from being about me and my sour beers to being about American sour beers. And I was lucky enough that when I pitched the idea to Christy Switzer and to Brewers Publication, that they were terrific, and they were excited about it, and they wanted to be a part of it. And they worked their hardest and got a bunch of terrific editors, Vonda Bates from De La Seine, Jennifer Taylor from Russian River, and then sort of the ultimate compliment, Vinny Chilurzo from Russian River, one of the best American brewers, period, and certainly best American sour brewers, wrote the intro for me.
Fantastic. Well, your book is titled American Sour Beers, but it's really a primer on sours kind of from around the world, and it starts with a primer from around the world. I was wondering if you could talk about what some of the differences are between the different sour beers.
Sure. American sour beer is really still coming into its own. I know there had been a couple of people approached to actually write a book about American sour beers previously who sort of felt like that maybe they weren't there yet, that the industry was still changing so rapidly. I think starting out talking about where these beers came from really gives some context on maybe where they are now and where they're going to end up. So the way I look at Belgian sour beers are sort of a combination of German and English. That's not really the history of it, but that's sort of really the flavors that you get out of it. So German sour beers, Berliner Weiss, Goes, tend to be relatively clean, bright lactic acidity, but not a lot of that sort of earthy, funky, fruity Brettanomyces character, although there is certainly some bread at play in some of those beers. English beers, on the other hand, the classic, the stock ales, what Cardrush Imperial used to be before it was sort of cleaned up, the old Suffolks of the world, the Gales Prize Old Ales, are much funkier. They have that big Brettanomyces ester and phenol profile, but they don't tend to be very acidic. They tend to be about the same pH, maybe slightly lower than just an ale or a lager, where Belgian beers really put that all together. The Lambics, the Flemish Reds, the Gooses have both the acidity, the lactic acid, a little bit of acetic acid from barrel aging, along with the Brettanomyces' big, bold, funky, fruity character. And learning about those beers, I think so many of the American sour brewers, that's where they started. They started reading Wild Brews. They started reading Brewing with Wheat by Stan Hieronymus. And their methods grew out of that, adapted to the ingredients we have here, to the equipment that they have that's designed for brewing single infusion mashes with relatively, English or German-inspired ingredients, and figuring out how to adapt that equipment to being able to do more complex, more interesting beers.
What equipment do you need to get started brewing sour beers at home?
Luckily, it's, literally nothing else. As long as you've got, a fermenter and a mash tun, or if you're doing extract, your standard boil kettle. The problem is that there really is a risk in letting these microbes into your clean beer equipment. And I got away with it for a while. I know other brewers have gotten away with it for a certain amount of time if you're very fastidious and you not only sanitize, but you are an amazing cleaner and you are soaking everything and the plastic doesn't have a scratch on it, you might be able to get away with it. What I suggest in the book, and I suggest to all brewers, is to save your old equipment. If you're thinking of maybe doing sour beers in 6 months or a year, hang on to that clean beer equipment. And as soon as it is starting to look, the tubing's a little bit cloudy, the bucket's starting to look a little beat up, save that, mark it, make sure you really identify that this is now your sour beer gear. You don't need overlap equipment for anything before the wort is chilled, so your mash tun, your boil kettle, your wort chiller, all that can be shared. But things like fermenters, bottling wand, autosiphon or racking cane, anything that beer, after you've added the yeast to it, is going to touch, best to have two sets. And then what I do is as soon as the new clean beer gear gets a little beat up, that gets handed down again maybe every year or so to the sour beers, and I throw out the old sour beer gear. But other than that, you don't need barrels. You don't need anything super special.
Certainly anything plastic, right?
Oh, well, anything plastic, again, that touches it after. So like I have a cooler mash tun, that's fine for both clean and sour beers because that's before the boil. If it's harboring anything, you'll be killed by the boil. But definitely anything plastic after. I share like my bottles between clean and sour beers. I just do a really good job. I used to, just rinse them with hot water and then spray them with Star San. Now I rinse them with hot water after I'm done drinking them and then clean them with PBW and hot water or OxyClean free, something like that, and then wash them again and then sanitize them. So it's a little bit more effort, but I'd rather be safe than sorry with how many sour beers I brew.
Yeah, you end up brewing extra sour beers if you contaminate the equipment, right?
And every once in a while, that can turn out a great beer, but more often than not, accidentally sour is not delicious.
Not exactly what you're shooting for.
Exactly.
Well, let's talk for a minute about sour wort production.
Sure. And so there really is, I do something sometimes called sour worting, so actually souring the wort after it's extracted from the mash, bringing it up. Before I sour it, I heat it up to about 190, 200 degrees, make sure I've killed everything that is in the wort naturally. I want to pitch my own selected microbes, and I pitch just lactobacillus, a big healthy culture of it, brings the pH down really quickly, and then I can boil it, kill those microbes. And this would be a way maybe to get around if you didn't want to have two sets of gear. You just wanted to sour the wort either in the kettle or in a keg or in a fermenter, something like that. And then everything else that beer touched, say you wanted to put it through your clean kegging system, something like that. However, for most sour beers, that's not what I do. Usually I do relatively standard wort production. You have to worry about things a little bit differently. If you're doing a sour beer, it's important to save additional carbohydrates for those souring bacteria. And so I generally will mash a little bit hotter than normal, 158, 159, maybe even 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And what that does is it makes some longer dextrins that are unfermentable. We always say unfermentable dextrins. Really unfermentable in that context just means two brewer's yeast. When we're talking about Brettanomyces, lactobacillus, and especially Pediococcus, Unfermentable means much longer chains. So for brewer's yeast, if you get over about 3 glucose molecules bond together, maltotriose, brewer's yeast isn't going to be able to ferment it. If we're talking about Brettanomyces or lactobacillus, if they make alpha-glucosidase, which is one of the enzymes that most of them produce, particularly Brettanomyces, they can go up to 9 glucose chains long. Pediococcus, on the other hand, can go up to starches. So, I mean, really, if you add flour to the boil, Pediococcus would likely, if you have a strain capable of it, would ferment that out and create a whole bunch of lactic acid. A couple other things you might be concerned about if you're doing a beer with Brettanomyces, getting a ferulic acid. So what you would mash at, say, 113 Fahrenheit for a wheat beer, where you're looking for a lot of clove flavor, that's a phenol. Brettanomyces will take that same compound and produce some of the funkier barnyard. In more concentrated amounts, it goes from farmyard, barnyard, horse blanket to smoky, a little bit more aggressive. Similar story if you get a lot of polyphenols out of the mash. So if you sparge with really hot water, or it's really high pH, or
oversparge, right?
Exactly, oversparge, or use a bunch of 6-row malt, or if you were to beat up the malt, say really, rather than just sort of lightly cracking the grain, you ran it through your food processor and just tore the husks up. Anything like that, you'll get polyphenols, and those will be converted into some of the more aggressive Band-Aid, smoky. I mean, a little bit can be okay. I mean, you can't avoid polyphenols altogether, but it will contribute a funkier edge to the beer.
Right.
And so those are things to worry about. With wort pH, I mean, we can talk about, maybe adding a little acid malt to disrupt conversion. We can talk about adding, if you're doing that sour worting method, you might want to add some acid malt or just some refined lactic acid to get the pH down into the mid-4s. If you don't do that, lactobacillus can make an enzyme that actually will break down proteins, and that's why Berliner Weisses often have really lousy head retention. They're, sort of that fizzy soda pop kind of head. If you drop the pH down to 4.5 or so, and then you pitch your lactobacillus, you're going to get much better head retention. Brewers also generally suggest adding lots of extra protein. So some people will use obviously a lot of wheat malt in a Berliner Weiss. Some brewers will use chit malt, which is the really under-modified stuff, just to make sure that there's enough protein in there just to have some reasonable head retention.
Well, Michael, I may have gotten ahead of myself a little bit. We dived into a whole bunch of sour wort production, but I was wondering if you could step back and maybe just describe some of the different ways you make sour beer. What sour wort is one method, right?
Yeah, certainly. And with sour wort, that's not sort of the whole story. There are some great brewers out there. Trinity Brewing out in Colorado does a method where they sour the wort and then they kill the lactobacillus, and then they will pitch a whole lot of Brettanomyces with no brewer's yeast.
Yeah.
And that's going to give you sort of the best of both worlds. It's going to be a very quick production because you're going to get all your lactic acid within a couple of days. And then all that Brettanomyces it's not going to give you the same character necessarily, or as complex a character maybe as a longer aging, a more complex mixed fermentation where there are waves of microbes taking over. But you'll get a lot of the sort of fruity and some of the funky flavors in a couple of weeks, just like you might for same timeline as a regular clean ale or a lager or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Michael, could you step back to the big picture level and maybe explain to us the basic methods you might use? There's more than one. We talked obviously for just the last couple of minutes about sour wort, but
yeah,
what are the big picture methods for producing sour beer?
So my personal method, and it's sort of a combination of a whole bunch of them, and I think it's just sort of the easiest. I make wort, I mash it, single infusion at 158 or so, cool it down to sort of normal ale fermentation temperature, whatever primary yeast I'm using, and I pitch everything. I pitch a healthy ale yeast, or you can even get away with a lager yeast. There's really no wrong answer when you're talking about what brewers yeast to use. New Belgium Brewing, actually, all their sours are lager-based, whether it's La Folie or the other blends, La Terroir and Eric's Ale and all those, have the sour portion is lager fermented and then soured. Sometimes it's blended with an ale, something like that. So I'll pitch brewer's yeast. I'll pitch a blend, so something like Y yeast Roselaire, White Lab sour blend number 1, Y yeast lambic blend. Just something that's relatively fresh that I know it's going to have a reasonable population of all the microbes I want. And then I'll take bottle dregs, so say the last half an inch of my favorite unpasteurized sour beer, Jolly Pumpkin, Russian River, Lost Abbey, Cascade, whatever. Swirl that up, dump it in.
Really?
Yeah, and that's just an easy cheater's way. It comes with a free beer to drink, but it's a way to get great microbes. They're maybe a little bit hardier, a little bit more aggressive than what's sold by Yeast Labs. This is changing.
So I mean, you're really souring in fermentation. Then you're not making sour wort like we were talking about a minute ago.
Exactly, and then at that point, you can either just leave it in the primary fermenter until the gravity stabilizes, so 9 months to a year, or after 3 or 4 weeks, if you want, you can rack off. If you leave it in the primary fermenter, this is what lambic breweries do. That brewer's yeast, with the low pH, with the time, there's no sugar left for them to eat. The alcohol's rising. They'll start dying. When they die, they go through a process called autolysis, where the cells break down and lyse. They actually split open and they spill out sugars that are fermentable by Brettanomyces, fatty acids, which can be converted into really cool esters. One of the great things Brettanomyces does is it can take these really unpleasant fatty acids. So caprylic acid. Capra comes from goat. So you can imagine how delicious it tastes. Or butyric acid, which tastes like Parmesan cheese or rancid butter or something like that. And it makes these beautiful esters. So if you slap an ethanol on, so just alcohol that you'd have in in any beer, to caprylic, you make ethyl caprate, which is pineapple. It's fruity. It's delicious. Ethyl butyrate is tropical, passion fruit, guava, those sorts of things. And so even if you taste some weird flavors in your sour beer partway through, don't get too freaked out. Hopefully Brettanomyces to the rescue.
Awesome.
But there are a lot of other methods, and the book profiles like 13 different methods. And a lot of them are just sort of variations on maybe timing, when it goes into a barrel, what microbes are pitched. Some breweries will do a clean primary fermentation and then fine or filter the beer, and then add Brettanomyces, and then wait for the Brettanomyces to get going, and then add Lactobacillus. Some of them will age in barrels and then go back into steel tanks to add fruit. Some of them will add fruit right away when the beer first goes into a barrel. Some will wait. I tend to wait a lot longer to add fruit. I'd rather have that bright, fresh, juicy fruit character added 2 or 3 months before bottling. If you add too early, it will start fading by the time you're ready to drink the beer. So I'd rather have that sort of bright, fresh fruit character, or a great dry hop character, something like that, along with the mature acid ester profile that you get from a 8-month-old, year-old sour beer.
Well, sour beer is made primarily using microbes and bacteria, or like we often say bugs, right?
That's right.
What are some of the various microbe options?
The main players. So as I talked about, almost all sour beers will have brewer's yeast, and they'll still do the bulk of fermentation. They will ferment most of the sugars. They'll make most of the alcohol. If you want to be sour, you really need bacteria. Brettanomyces is very important in sour beer production, but it doesn't really make a lot of acidity, and it's actually a yeast. Myces is fungus, so just like Saccharomyces. Mm-hmm. Lactobacillus is much more quick-acting. It's also not quite as aggressive as Pediococcus. In fact, when we talk about lambics and we talk about that high hopping rate, lots of aged hops, and its preservative effect, a lot of that preservative effect is against Lactobacillus. Lambic brewers are worried about Lactobacillus getting into the wort when it's still 110 or 120 degrees. Under ideal circumstances, Lactobacillus can double every 20 minutes, so it just takes a couple of cells and, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, you can see within just a few hours you can go from 100 cells to a whole heck of a lot of cells. That drops the pH too quickly. That makes the Saccharomyces upset, and by upset I mean it won't complete fermentation, will leave behind some nasty flavors that Brettanomyces might not clean up. So lambic brewers rely on Pediococcus. Pediococcus is much slower moving. The only real big disadvantage of Pediococcus is that it also produces diacetyl. So if you're using Pediococcus, you really have to bring Brettanomyces along. Pediococcus will leave this buttery butterscotch flavor behind. Brettanomyces over the long term will clean that up. Pediococcus is also, in some cases, although actually not many, it will make your beer sick. I know a lot of people sort of have heard this term, your beer is going to be sick, and haven't seen it. The first wine barrel a couple of friends and I here in DC did got sick. The beer became viscous, almost snotty, when we stuck a sample thief in.
Lovely.
3 or 4 months, a string sort of extended from out of the beer up to that, and the mouthfeel was horrific. And this is exopolysaccharide, so just exo outside, poly many saccharide sugars. So it's just long chains of sugar molecules, Pediococcus are strung together. Brettanomyces, Pediococcus will eventually break these down. Some brewers say that this is the best thing that can happen to your sour beer. Some brewers say that there's something really wrong with your sour beer that's no good. Cantillon and Russian River both have had beers go sick. If they have beers go sick and they're excited about it, I'm excited about it.
Excellent.
And so Brettanomyces, we've talked about a little. This is going to keep fermenting. Brettanomyces, if you're just doing a beer with just Brett, with no lactic acid bacteria, no lactobacillus, no Pediococcus, it won't be sour, but you also don't need to save those carbohydrates for it. So where lactobacillus and Pediococcus need those malt sugars, need those carbohydrates to make more lactic acid, Brettanomyces, you can mash a beer very dry, use a Saison yeast in primary, pitch Brett later on, and it will keep working. It will eat cellobiose, which is wood sugar from oak. It will eat sugars released by the dying primary yeast. It will eat all sorts of things. It will work on those phenols. And so it can make a very characterful beer. So something like Orval, the classic Belgian Brettanomyces beer, is fermented clean, and then Brett is added just at bottling. And over time, that even though there's very little sugar left in that beer, the Brett will keep working in the bottle and produce a really beautiful character after a year or two. And so if that's your goal, you can, age with Brett either in a keg. If you do it in a bottle, use heavy gauge bottles. Try to get the beer as dry as possible. It only takes a reduction of about 0.003 gravity points to fully carbonate a beer. So if you're priming like normal and you're adding Brett and it's eating through another 3 or 4 points, you'll have some very overcarbonated beer, and it can be very dangerous. You can get bottle bombs. You can get a real mess on your hands if you're not very careful. So I'd particularly early on go into a fermenter, let it age, gravity stable, then bottle.
Excellent. Can you talk a little bit about time? I know it can take quite a while to make a sour beer, right?
Yeah, no, and that's one of the tricky things. And I know Y Yeast, I haven't tried it yet, is releasing a new special yeast blend that they say can make a great sour beer in a month or two. There are ways around it. We talked about sour worting, but really the best sour beers take time. And it becomes less about speeding that up and more about figuring out how you want to deal with it. So when I started brewing sour beers, I was just going
to say, when you say time, how much, roughly?
I've got a beer downstairs that I started fermenting 2 years ago that's still in the carboy.
Wow. So you're talking a year, maybe 2 years in many cases?
Yeah, and that's probably more than, Jolly Pumpkin does some beers. They're in the barrel for 2 weeks. It's just depending on exactly what you're looking for and what sort of character you're trying to get. When I started brewing sour beers, I'd just been laid off of my job selling terrible mortgages to people right before the financial collapse. I'd been there for 4 months. I hated the job. I got laid off. I got a new job down in D.C., but I had a couple of months off. And I decided I would brew a couple of sour beers in Massachusetts. I'd leave them there at my parents' house. They could top off the airlock whenever that needed to be. And every time I went to visit them for the next year or so, I'd come in, give my mom a hug, and then I'd go downstairs and pull a couple of samples. So it's sort of out of sight and out of mind. So if you have a cousin's house or a friend's basement that's a nice stable temperature, you can age your beer there, out of sight, out of mind. These days, it really helps me just to keep new sour beers going. So rather, say next Saturday I'm going to brew a sour beer, rather than thinking, okay, it's going to be 9 months until I bottle this, and then it's going to need a bottle condition for 3 months, and then I'm going to be I'm thinking about that beer that I have down there. They'll be ready to bottle in 2 weeks. And so getting that pipeline going, and that really opens up a lot of fun opportunities to go to the farmer's market, buy some fruit. Hey, taste the fruit. Which of your beers, go down there, pull samples. Which of these beers would this work best with? You can blend beers with each other. And that's really how most sour brewers operate. They have a sort of a library of beers to work with. They save beers that are too sour to serve on their own, and that's your acid beer. That's what you're then going to use in that beer that has that beautiful aromatic, fruity profile that you love, but doesn't have the acidity that you want. And that's sort of the tricky thing with sour beers, is you have to sort of decouple that idea where, I'm brewing a batch of wort and I will have a batch of beer. Your feeding wort into your souring, structure, and beer's coming out the other side, but it's not as straight a line as maybe it would be with a Pilsner or a IPA.
Very cool. Well, Michael, could you talk for a minute about spontaneous fermentation and using wild yeast and wild bugs?
Yeah, no, this is, to me, one of the most exciting areas. And for a long time, people talked like the Seine Valley, like the area around Brussels where lambics are made, was really special, that there was absolutely nowhere else on earth that you could make a beer anything like lambic from wild bugs. And there have been some really fantastic brews. Allagash has these cool ship beers. Russian River does beatification. Jolly Pumpkin has done. All of their beers are actually soured with wild microbes. They pitch ale yeast, but everything else in that brewery is completely spontaneous. That works on a commercial scale a little bit better when you're talking about barrels. A lot of what's going on at lambic breweries, sure, there's a cool ship. Sure, some microbes are getting in there during sort of this into this big open kiddie pool, but gigantic shallow basin. But really, what's happening is that those microbes are in the barrels now. They're in the ceiling. They're blowing around the brewery from dried krausen overflowing. You don't have that at your house, sadly. If you brew beer regularly, maybe you've got a little bit of a local culture. Same thing with your backyard. There probably aren't going to be that many wild microbes. So what worked for me was to set out wort outside a couple of places in my house, just some low-hopped wort, pretty low gravity. Let it get going for a week or two, get that fermentation going. Early on, don't taste it. You can get E. coli, you can get salmonella. If you want to be careful, drop the pH to about, again, 4.4, 4.3. That will inhibit those nasty guys. Although there are some people that argue that they're beneficial, but we won't get into that right now. Let them grow up, step them up. If they look gross, if they smell gross, if there's weird colors, throw it out, don't even taste it. If it smells okay and maybe you measure the gravity and it's dropped a bit, you've got some alcohol, maybe the pH is down in the low 4s, give it a taste. If you like the result, maybe that's the time to brew that full batch, pitch it in there. I was really surprised. The first time I tried this, I got 2 of the 3 stars I did. Turned out pretty well. One had black mold. It didn't look good, didn't smell good. I tossed it. I pitched the other 2 into a lambic-like wort. And initially, for the first month, it was like a tropical Hefeweizen. It was bright. It was fruity. It had a little bit of clove. That died down as time went on, and sort of tobacco came out. And now, at about 2.5 or 3 years old, it's gotten beautiful. It's funky. It's very lightly tart. It's not vinegary or there's no rancid butter or anything like that. It's just a very pleasant, surprisingly unexciting beer. If anything, I was disappointed that the flavors are bright and clean. And that's sort of the most basic way. There are a lot of people now going through isolating. Jeff Mello at Bootleg Biology did a great seminar at NHC on streaking out plates. I'm just happy to sort of pitch everything in there, let them fight it out. If you like the result of that first beer, take a scoop of that and throw it into the beer you do a couple of months or a couple of years later, and sort of develop your own house culture. And that's what lambic breweries have been doing for dozens or hundreds of years, depending on the place. Just sort of saving these microbes almost like a seed saver would. If it tastes good, you keep it. If it doesn't taste good, you chuck it out. Starting a new barrel, take a scoop from your favorite barrel and put it in there with the wort. Awesome. It's romantic. It's exciting. It's not where I would start. It's not what I would do for my first sour beer, but I think it's the sort of cool thing that almost every homebrewer should try at some point, just to be able to tell that story of, hey, here's this beer that I brewed. I've got a wild mulberry tree growing in my backyard. I took 2 gallons of that batch and put it onto wild mulberries, and I made the closest representation you can to where I live. The flavors you can get around here. Same thing as using homegrown hops or growing your own barley, anything like that, but capturing your own microbes using your own local fruit.
Well, you can. I'm sorry. You have a chapter on fermenting with 100% Brett. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. So, not using conventional yeast. Yeah,
no, and we touched on this briefly earlier, but you don't have to make these as sour beers. Some of my favorite beers right now are 100% Brettanomyces fermented IPAs. Some Brettanomyces species, particularly, I should say strains, Brettanomyces bruxellensis Trois or Dre, depending on who you're getting it from. was originally isolated from a goose from Driefonteinen, J&J Blau. It's one of sort of the more sought after, not much was produced kind of gooses. Adam Avery loved it, gave it to a yeast lab. They streaked it out. They found this culture. And it makes sort of bright pineapple, fruity flavors that go so terrifically with American hops. So I consult for a brewery called Modern Times. We did 3 different beers with Brett Dre. The first one, sort of my baby, was Citra Centennial, a little bit of Chinook, beer called Neverwhere. It doesn't taste funky. I mean, it doesn't taste like you'd expect a sour. It's not sour. It doesn't have farmyard or barnyard character. And what we're doing here is, rather than having just a tiny bit of Brettanomyces, so White Labs tubes normally have about 3 billion cells, we're looking to pitch 150 billion or 200 billion cells, what you would maybe for a lager, if not just sort of an ale. In that case, Brettanomyces works very quickly. The fermentation is done within generally 2 weeks, sometimes 3 or 4 weeks, maybe as long as 5 or 6 weeks. And it behaves much more like ale yeast. And one of the reasons we were talking about phenols earlier, one of the reasons that Brettanomyces is funky is when you use it in combination with one of these spicy phenolic, they're called phenol off flavor positive brewer's yeast. It takes those clove and peppery phenols and turns them into the funky phenols. And so without having a brewer's yeast in there, or if you use, say, a lager yeast or a clean ale yeast, an American ale yeast or a Kolsch or something, you get a much cleaner, fruitier profile. And the turnaround time is much faster. So if that 9 months or a year does not sound appealing to you, try out a 100% Brett beer. You can repitch it just like you could ale yeast. People are doing 100% Brett porters. The beer will end up a little bit thinner. Brettanomyces doesn't produce glycerin. It's going to eat through a lot of those dextrins that brewer's yeast wouldn't. So, maybe try adding a little rye, a little flaked oat, something like that, to add back some protein to
give it some body, right?
Body. Exactly. But granted, I mean, I wouldn't expect this to be, this is probably not a great strain for an imperial stout. But in a beer like an IPA that's already going to be pretty crisp, pretty clean, mouthfeel-wise, I think it works beautifully. Different strains are going to give you different characters, but they tend to be sort of a subdued version. So like Y-yeast Brettanomyces is very cherry, funky in secondary fermentation. In primary, a friend did a 100% Brettanomyces stout. I could have sworn if he'd entered it in as a fruit beer, a cherry stout, I think he could have, I'm not sure he would have won, but I think he would have gotten, no one would have said there's no cherries in this, or this is a sour beer. It's also one of the real things that is truly American. This is only a little more than 10 years ago. Tommy Arthur of then Pizza Port, now Lost Abbey, and Peter Buchart, then in still New Belgium, got together at Solana Beach, brewed Mo Bet Breu, which is the first, at least that I'm aware of, bottled commercial 100% Brett beer. People loved it. And that sort of launched, all these beers, whether it's Russian River Sanctification, Crooked Stave. Chad Jacobson did some terrific research on this and does a whole bunch of terrific beers out in Colorado. And little pockets here and there. And now in Belgium, De Pref has done a couple 100% Brett beers. So it's sort of an idea that America has figured out. There's nothing, truly radical about this idea until you realize that people have been brewing with Brettanomyces, knowingly or not, for hundreds of years, and it wasn't until a decade ago that someone said, "Hey, what if we just add Brettanomyces? No brewer's yeast, no bacteria, just see what it does on its own."
Well, Michael, I was wondering if you could provide a few tips on aging and fermenting with fermenting these sour beers.
Yeah. I think the first thing to say is that you want sort of a moderate to low temperature. A lot of breweries try to hold in the low 60s. If you're not using a barrel, I think it's okay to be a bit higher than that. Maybe even the summer, mid to high 70s you can get away with, as long as you're making sure that airlock stays filled. Laying oxygen in is very risky. Oxygen, whether you have Brettanomyces or very commonly acetobacters in the air, you'll get acetic acid. Acetic acid is vinegar. A little bit can maybe sharpen up the acid profile. Too much and it'll hit you on the back of the throat, this real sharpness. And the problem with that, we talked about all these terrific esters Brettanomyces produces. The problem with acetic acid is add an ethanol onto that, you get ethyl acetate. Ethyl acetate, a little bit again, can be very pleasant, pear, fruity, a little bit more solvent, and too often nail polish remover is what I get out of it. I do everything I can to keep oxygen away from my beer. I don't do any of these sort of methods to intentionally add oxygen. I think probably more than enough gets in there, just pulling the occasional sample. So keep the temperature moderate, keep it dark, just like you would any other beer.
I mean, do some people add oxygen when they're working with sour beers?
I'm not.
I'm talking about later in the fermentation, not up front.
And actually, the new Y yeast blend calls for, I think they say periodic aeration. It's I'd have to look up the name. It was De Palme or something like that. What some people do, there are all these sort of schemes where you might, and I tried this one. I put a Teflon tape wrapped toasted chair leg in through the mouth of my carboy. That worked well until it sucked up enough of the fermenting beer that it swelled, since it's wood, and cracked the glass.
Oh, nice.
Some people, sort of a better version of that is using maybe an oak dowel through a stopper. The problem with a lot of these is you need both a way for oxygen, for CO2 to get out from fermentation. People have played around with, just sort of opening the bung once in a while, maybe with putting a vinyl tube that sort of dips down into the wort or the beer. I don't think it's worthwhile. If you want some of that vinegar character, I think you'd be a lot better off taking maybe a half gallon or a quart of the beer, putting it into a growler, maybe putting a cheesecloth with a rubber band around it, putting it somewhere nice and warm, letting it get really super vinegary, and then adding that back to taste at bottling. Then you'll be taking it away. You could pasteurize it. You could add pasteurized vinegar even, homemade or not. I think those are all better options for a real controlled precision kind of addition. The problem there is if you've got Brettanomyces, you can still get ethyl acetate. You can still get nail polish remover. It's not a flavor that I want, but that's the great thing about sour beers and beer in general is if you do, there's no wrong answer. Just look for a balance that works for your palate, for your taste. As I mentioned sort of earlier, you don't need a barrel. Barrels will let in oxygen, and that sort of increases the risk for acetic acid. If you just want wood character, add oak cubes. If you want wine character, if you want that wine barrel character, rather than soaking the oak cubes in wine, I'd rather add the oak cubes to taste and then add the wine to taste separately. I don't think that there's an advantage to combining this sort of 2-for-1 kind of thing. Fruit, I mentioned, add that later. You can add, I personally, I'm a big fan of the fresher, the riper, the more heirloom, the more local, the better. Particularly for more subtle fruits, strawberries, peaches, nectarines. I've never liked the purees. I've always got better character going to someplace local, pick your own, farmer's market, whatever. Tasting, letting them get not just ripe, but even almost a little overripe. You don't want them to be moldy, but a little soft. That's when the aromatics, the sugars are at their best. You can certainly, Russian River does a lot with dried fruit in supplication and consecration. There are breweries that do terrific things with fruit concentrates, like Lost Abbey will actually, for some of their fruit beers, they'll prime with the fruit concentrates. They'll have real cherries in there, but then rather than just using priming sugar, they'll use sour cherry concentrate, and that really traps in all those great aromatics, not letting them be fermented out.
Well, Mike, I was wondering if you could talk for a moment about blending beers. I know you have a chapter on that as well.
Yeah, and that's really where a lot of sour beer is. It's process. I can give you a flow chart that says how Cascade brews their amazing fruit sour beers and their big barrel-y thing. Blending, there's no magic bullet to that. There are some breweries that don't do anything too complex. They make a whole bunch of barrels of something. They taste all the barrels. If any of them are gross, they throw them out. They blend the rest of them. Maybe they have some acid beer or some beer, 100% Brett beer, something like that, to thin out acid. But the real creativity is places like New Belgium that have a whole bunch of these giant oak tanks. As homebrewers, sort of the 5-gallon carboys or maybe a 15-gallon barrel is the equivalent, and they taste them all, and they start blending and they start playing with them. And to me, the easiest thing to do is use a scale. Every time you do a blend, start with an empty cup, put it on there, zero it out, and make a 100-gram blend. And that's a pretty reasonable size. And then you'll have easy, percentages. If you use 20 grams of the 2-year-old Lambic and 10 grams of the year-old Flemish Red and 70 grams or whatever's left of an Ode Brune, you're going to know, okay, when I blend this, it'll be 70%, 20%, 10%, or whatever. Take good notes. there's nothing worse than, well, okay, I made the first blend, I tasted it. Well, it needs a little more acidity. Dump that in. Yeah, it's almost there. Maybe a little bit more of this one. Oh man, that's perfect. Okay. So now you've got, 2 ounces of perfect beer. How are you now going to make that, having, messed up the ratio, changed everything around? So start with the same blend that you would have otherwise. Start with a fresh blend and then go from there. Keep notes, make sure you know exactly what's in that glass. Get some friends over. I tricked a couple of friends once to coming over. We all made our own blend. Everyone helped me bottle, 2 gallons of their blend, and then they helped me bottle the rest of it. My blend, all the others, I kept some of their blend. They got some of everyone else's blend. It was a really fun day and good use of a whole bunch of sour beer that otherwise I would have been sitting in my basement by myself bottling. And it would go into my barrel storage room that probably has 2,500 bottles of sour beer at the moment, which is a real it's out of control. But that's sort of what happens with these.
You may
beers.
have a problem there, Michael.
I would, my
2,500 bottles.
Yeah, well, we've got. Don't tell the TTB or whoever I'd be in trouble with. A good friend and I, who's now a professional brewer, have a 60-gallon wine barrel, a 53-gallon apple brandy barrel. I've got all manner of carboys and other things. I'm always doing split batches. But one of the great things about sour beer is that Brettanomyces is going to keep scavenging oxygen. They found Brettanomyces in 30-year-old bottles of Berliner Weiss. So even if a little bit of oxygen sneaks in under the crown cap, even if hop compounds are breaking down, releasing oxygen, the beer tastes remarkably fresh. So whether you're doing a Brett IPA, those hops are, with a normal IPA are going to be faded out in a couple of months. A hoppy sour beer can be good for a year or two. It's not indefinite, it's not perfect, but I've had sour beers that I've personally aged eight years now. I still have a couple bottles from those very early batches that taste as good or better than they did 4 or 5 years ago. It's really remarkable. And so luckily these sour beers, not all of them again, but if they're stored well in my basement, I have a little AC unit that keeps it about 65 degrees, just keep getting better. And so now I can go down there and it's not, well, if you're brewing clean beers, maybe you've got barley wine or imperial stout, and then it's relatively fresh stuff. With this, I can go down there and, hey, here's that sour cherry beer that my wife's parents gave us, cherries from their tree. Oh, here's the day I proposed to my wife, we stopped and bought a bunch of raspberries and put them into a sour beer. And I can have that beer, and hopefully 10 years from now, when that top of the wedding cake is long gone, we can enjoy a glass of sour beer and think about where we were 10 years ago and what we were doing, and that's that beer that we put into that bottle. Very
cool. Well, and finally, Michael, I was wondering if you'd tell us a little bit about troubleshooting sour beers.
Yeah, one of the things you don't get too freaked out. You're going to taste some weird things. You're going to see some weird things. You're going to get that pellicle on the top that's going to be white and crusty and gross looking. Don't get too freaked out. There are some things that will go away. So we talked about sick beer. That's fine. Diacetyl, that'll go away. There are some things that you just sort of, maybe you can blend them out. A beer gets too sour. It's not going to get less sour over time. But maybe you can brew a younger, maltier beer that can help balance that out in a blend. Then there are things that you have to learn when to pull the plug. When a couple of months ago, one of my good friends talked me into doing a guana banana sour beer. Guana banana is sour sop, it's also called. The puree we got was frozen Goya puree, and it kind of smelled a little cheesy footy. And I just sort of thought, well, this is something that's going to, it's going to ferment. It's just a little bit of fruit and a whole bunch of great sour beer. I'm sure it'll be great. No, I tasted that cheesy footy flavor for 6 months. And I said, okay, I'm going to cut that. I'm going to add some raspberry blackberry brown ale that's kind of bland. Add that in. Wait another 2 years. It still sort of tastes rubbery, cheesy. Eventually, I just said, that's it. I would have saved myself a lot of headache dumping it earlier, but when you've already waited 2 years, you go, well, why not wait another year? But after 4 years, it was starting to taste, oxidized, old, and I knew it wasn't worth the effort to bottle it. And same thing with acetic acid or nail polish remover. I had my first lambic. I just pitched a blend, and this was 8 years ago. And I imagine, I didn't check the date, but the local homebrew store probably wasn't doing a big business in lambic blend in 2006. And it took 4 days to start fermenting. I still have bottles. It tastes like pine sol. It's awful. So that's
Pine Sol's not my favorite.
No, and not like, like hops can be old piney or something like that. This has that real like detergent chemical. And that's sort of the big thing. My advice is pitch enough yeast, pitch a bunch of sources, don't ferment it too hot, don't let oxygen in. These are the things that can sort of ruin a beer. Your beer might only be 90% what it could have been with a tiny bit of oxygen or a little bit of an underpitch. But I think particularly early on, better to be safe, to figure out exactly what works for you, for your taste buds, and then experiment slowly from there from a decent beer to get a great beer. I personally, my method works for my tastes. I've found that, depending on what ball dregs I choose, depending on how hot I go with the mash, those are the things that I like to play with to get just the flavor I want. And then I use that as a base for all sorts of other flavor additions. So right now I'm drinking a Saison that had some Brettanomyces, and then I dry hop the heck out of it with Mosaic and Citra and Nelson Sauvin, these big, juicy hops that sort of compound on that Brett. I've played with fruit, I've played with honey, I've played with spices. I've done sour beers with acorn squash. I've done sour beers with Cabernet grapes. There's all sorts of flavors that you can add on there. But some of the best ones are that simple, Pilsner and wheat base with a bunch of microbes and a little bit of oak and 2 years in the fermenter. So sour beers are a lot like clean beers. It's whatever you want to make them. You can brew to style or you can brew whatever crazy idea. They're chili pepper sour beers. There's all sorts of stuff I talk about.
So, Michael, where can people find your new book?
Hopefully everywhere that other brewers publication titles can be found. So if you could get hops and yeast and IPA and all those terrific books, you should be able to get mine at your local homebrew store. Right now you can hop on Amazon online and grab it, or honestly, any online bookseller hopefully should be carrying it.
Pull it up right here.
If there are any real bookstores left, please go in. If they don't have it, ask for it. That's the way, hopefully, this sort of book, expands out into a wider audience. And I'd really appreciate, send me your feedback. I'm available. You can my email's on the blog. If you find any typos or anything like that, let me know. There's going to be an ebook coming out in a couple of months, and I think we're going to have a chance to get any typo fixes in there. Luckily, haven't heard any yet. But yeah, let me know what you think, and certainly let bookstores and brewers publication, if this is the sort of thing you're excited about, if this is a book that maybe targets homebrewers a little bit more specifically than some of the other recent publications, let them know. And that's really the way that hopefully we can keep getting these terrific books. Because I certainly brew commercially a little bit, I consult, but I'm still a home brewer, and I think homebrewers. It's hard to write for homebrewers if you're not an active homebrewer, I think. And that's hopefully what comes across in this, that these are things that really aren't that tricky, but you can really have some fantastic results, and you can make some really interesting beers as good or better than the commercial beers out there, because you can really tailor it exactly to your taste.
Well, thank you, Michael. I really appreciate you being on the show.
Great to be on as always. I really enjoyed finally getting to meet you at National Homebrewers Conference.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. It was great conference this year. And again, today my guest was Michael Tonsmeire. He has a new book out called American Sour Beers, which was just released by Brewers Publications. And he also runs a website at madfermentationist.com, the Rad Fermentationist. Michael, it's been a great pleasure having you on the show. Thanks.
Thanks.
Well, a thank you to Mr. Michael Tonsmeire for joining me this week. Also, a big thank you to this week's sponsor, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Issue number 2 is packed with great articles on brewing, and you can start your subscription today at a discount at beerandbrewing.com. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com. Use the offer code BeerSmith to get a 20% discount. And also, please sign up for the American Homebrewers Association forum at homebrewersassociation.org/forum. where you can join 22,000 fellow brewers talking about beer and brewing. Be sure to thank both our sponsors for supporting this podcast. Thank you again for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.